So these are, again, the case where there's sub-additivity in the production function over some range. And so it's more efficient to have one firm producing than to have two or more. And the basic problem here is, you'd like to achieve the economies of scale and also have firms pricing at marginal cost. And the simplest approach is to just mandate that the firm is forced to price at marginal cost. The problem is, usually when there's sub-additivity, the marginal cost is below the average cost. And that means that if you force firms to charge it, the firm is going to make a loss, right? This follows almost directly from the existence of economies of scale, though it's not completely immediate, because as you remember, if we can have sub-additivity without economies of scale over the full range. And so it might be that at the optimum, the marginal cost is actually above the average cost. Now, in general, though, we'll have economies of scale through a wide range, and therefore the marginal cost is below the average cost. And if we force the firm to charge marginal cost, the firm will make a loss and will require a subsidy from the government. And this requires not just a regulator who has the authority to force the firm to do some things, but it requires revenue from the central government. And that will usually come from a tax on some of the consumers or all the consumers of this good, or on the economy as a whole. This service then is basically being operated like a public good or a service. Now, this does happen in some cases. Elliot is not here, I don't think. No, Elliot Sanabria. Does anyone else want to give examples of public services that run at a loss and where that loss is made up by government revenue? Anyone think of an example of that? Quite a few utilities are like that. Another one is public transportation. So you do not pay anywhere near the costs of running Transmilenio as consumers. And the Postal Service often makes a loss. Many other government services, so like in the US, the Department of Motor Vehicles hardly charges you anything. But the costs of running it are much, much bigger. And they do that because the marginal cost is not very large of charging an initial person, but there are large fixed costs of setting up the infrastructure of the DMV. Okay. Now, there are two other ways, other than just mandating prices equal to marginal cost, that have been proposed to achieve the ideal solution. One is perfect price discrimination. And we're going to talk a lot more about price discrimination on Monday. But if a firm can perfectly price discriminate, that is, if they can charge every person exactly what they're willing to pay, then they can extract the full value to consumers of having the service. And this is almost never feasible entirely, because you need to know so much about how much the consumers are worth, but sometimes you can get close. So sometimes you can, as we'll talk about on Monday, do things that capture a very large fraction of the consumer's value, and that would eliminate a lot of the problems associated with the monopoly distortion. Now, if this works well, it's not actually so much different from a local income tax, because if you think that people's willingness to pay for products is close to being proportional to their income, and you extract all of that, well, then you're almost imposing a little income tax on people. And we'll talk more about all of this on Monday. A second possibility is to provide subsidies, but not regulation. So if we provided a subsidy to the firm which was exactly equal to the marginal surplus, that is, if on the margin it was equal to the quantity that he was producing times the amount that caused prices to fall for consumers, then the firm would internalize the consumer's surplus and reduce the price that he charges. Now, of course, that is going to require the government providing a subsidy, and therefore it's going to raise many of the same issues that a marginal cost pricing mandate would raise. So basically the only major difference between these solutions and mandating that prices be at marginal cost is that the monopolist is going to capture all the benefits here, right? With third-degree price discrimination, he extracts the full surplus. With this subsidy, again, he gets paid by the government for doing lower prices, right? Now, one way to solve that distributional problem is to make a bunch of different people bid for the right to be the monopolist, a little bit like what I was describing before in terms of the concession auction. Okay, however, all of these solutions require a lot of information. So marginal cost regulation requires you to know the whole cost curve, because you need to know exactly what the marginal cost is at this point. It's not enough just to know sort of overall how much money the company needs to operate. You need to actually know what's the marginal cost of providing a little bit more at the optimal quantity. And you need that in order both to determine the subsidy you need to provide in order to get to the cost level or how much to mandate the cost to be, but you also need to know the whole rest of the cost curve to figure out how much of a subsidy you need to provide in order to get this guy to at least recoup his average cost. So the other problem with this is that if the company is able to raise its costs or pretend like it has higher costs in a way that doesn't affect its marginal costs, that won't even raise the price and won't even reduce the number of people that are in the market that the firm has to serve. So it becomes really, really easy for the firm to manipulate its costs to try to get more of a subsidy from the government, right? Second, if we try to provide Pigouvian subsidies or the subsidy that I described, this requires us to know a whole lot about the demand curve. We need to know what the slope of the demand curve is at a given point. And that could be quite difficult to achieve. To get perfect price discrimination, the firm needs to know exactly how much every person is willing to pay. And extracting whatever revenues the company gets by bidding for the right to be the monopolist requires that there are two different competing firms, both of whom know the total amount of profit they'd make in the market, which is quite hard. And perhaps the biggest problem, which we're going to talk about on Tuesday, is imagine that you do manage to subsidize the firm down to marginal cost. Now the firm's making a loss, but how on earth do we know whether it was even worth creating the market in the first place? Right? We could have this firm charging marginal cost, taking a big loss, and then how do we know whether we should even just shut down the industry as a whole or keep it running? It's not obvious, because in both cases they'll be making a loss, right? So we can't use whether the firm's making a loss as an indicator of whether the market is beneficial to exist at all or not. So that creates big problems for knowing which markets we should be doing this in and which markets are just total boondoggles, where the guy says, oh yeah, it's worth creating a market here. Give me a big subsidy and I'll charge my marginal cost. So there's a lot of informational problems with trying to implement marginal cost regulation. Another major problem is capture and corruption, which is a bit like what I was just saying. So regulation can quickly become a means of corruption if the regulators are cozy with the people who they regulate it and have an easy time controlling them because the public isn't really paying much attention. It becomes very easy to use the regulation, especially with these subsidies, to just take a bunch of money from the public, right? This is similar to the issue with licensure, and there's some evidence that this happens. So organized consumer groups that monitor what's going on can help somewhat, but they're not going to be as organized as the firm is. And this is going to be particularly problematic when the industry is very complicated and opaque, because it makes it hard to monitor the corruption. In some sense, this isn't really different from the informational problems, because it's precisely the opaqueness of what's going on in the industry, the lack of information being available to people, that makes this sort of corruption possible, right? So the key is to put someone in charge who has both good incentives and good information. Now, to address some of the concerns with marginal cost pricing, what's more often used in practice is average cost pricing. This is often called rate of return or cost plus regulation, because the firm is allowed to capture some small amount of profit in order to defray the costs of putting the capital in. The simplest way to model this is to just put the capital into part of their costs and to say we have a price cap at average cost. Now, what might be some of the benefits of average cost pricing over marginal cost pricing? Gabrielle. Okay. Anyone else? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, and those are usually easier to observe because you can get it from accounting and so forth, right? Yeah, that's probably the biggest benefit, is that it helps with the external subsidy. It's easier to measure the costs. You only need to know the average cost at one point, right? You don't need to know like the whole cost curve and the marginal cost and the average. It requires a lot more to do the marginal cost pricing than to do the average cost pricing. If consumers buy the good, and this is another crucial point, if consumers are willing to buy the goods at the average cost price, then you know that the market is worth existing. So you're not going to create total boondoggles this way, right? Because if people are willing to pay the average cost, at least it's worth creating the market, right? So average cost lessens the informational problems associated with marginal cost pricing. Now, average cost regulation is extremely common throughout the economy. Does anyone, Francisco's not here, so does anyone else want to give some examples of average cost pricing that you can think of? Well, I mean, one is most utilities run this way. Most utilities do not get external subsidies from the government. Most run at cost. And there's usually a state regulatory board in the United States. I don't know exactly how it works here in Colombia, but there's a state regulatory board that monitors and makes sure that they're not getting paid more than their average cost, that they keep their prices down there. And this is usually overseen by consumer advocates. It's questionable how well, but that's the idea. Most public transport and infrastructure is required to eventually recoup their costs. Sometimes they're subsidized, but a lot of public transit is actually required to recoup their costs by the prices that they charge. Sometimes they get subsidies, but often they're required to eventually make the money back. Telecommunications in many countries are regulated, or at least used to be regulated, and were forced to get prices in the, at average cost. So until the 1980s, AT&T was a regulated utility, and it was required to make no more than a very minimal amount of profits. What happened in the United States is that local calling, when you would call from you to your neighbor, that would be very, very cheap or free, and it would be subsidized by higher rates on long distance calling. When AT&T was broken up in the 1980s, it was forced to give access to all the local lines to competing firms. But then firms started merging, and now we're basically back to two carriers in the United States, so we're basically back to the monopoly of AT&T, but without regulation this time, which is kind of interesting. A more broad thing is that often in countries, even if you don't have explicit regulation, if a firm is making a lot of profits, often the government gets upset and tries to force them to come in and lower their price. So that ends up leading to de facto average cost pricing, even if not explicit. Now, average cost regulation is pretty obvious when there's just one product, right? Because you just force the price of that product down to being equal to the average cost. But when price discrimination is possible, it gets more complicated. Should you allow the firm to price discriminate? Well, it depends on, to some extent, on whether it increases social surplus, which we'll talk about on Monday. More subtly, you can ask, does it raise firms' profits by enough that it's worth allowing them to do it, even if it doesn't necessarily directly increase social surplus? Because if it increases the firm's profits by some, then you can force down their prices in other areas, right? And so usually in public utilities, a lot of price discrimination is allowed to try to increase the firm's profit so they can push down prices elsewhere. Second is, and related, is multi-product pricing. So when there's multiple products, you have to spread the distortion caused by the market power over all the different products. And the usual rule for this is what's called Ramsey pricing, where you mark up the products as the inverse elasticity of the products, which is very, very similar to the basic monopoly pricing rule. So basically what this is saying is that you're going to use a lot of the same things that monopolies are going to do if they were unregulated, but then you're going to push down their overall level of prices down to average cost. That's basically how you extend the principle of average cost pricing to when there's multiple products or price discrimination. Okay. Now, average cost pricing we've so far described as an outcome of a regulation by the government. But average cost pricing is something that happens much more broadly than just when the government imposes it. So if there's free entry into an industry, that's often going to drive down prices to average cost. If there's a large number of equally able managers, we don't have the talent situation like we talked about, and you can easily get access to capital so that the industry is not so hard to enter and it doesn't require so much talent, then any profits that exist will attract someone else to enter until the point where the price is driven down to average cost. So average cost pricing is often used by economists as a model of what industries are like when there's free entry available. Now, obviously, I gave you this whole lecture about how the fact that talent exists will often stop things from being driven down to average cost pricing, and that is the case in many industries. But in some cases, this is a useful benchmark. Okay. And some have even claimed that even if there isn't free entry into an industry, or even if it is a monopoly, sometimes firms will be so afraid of another firm coming in and taking its profits that it will have to drive prices quite close down to average cost. So in this view, anytime a firm is making a profit, it's going to be afraid that someone will enter and take that profit away. And so the firm is going to drive down its prices to the point where no one would want to enter the industry. Now, this is a bit of a strange story, though it was pretty influential, because it requires a lot of assumptions. It requires that the competitor can easily come in and grab the monopoly and earn all of its profits. That the incumbent can't, once the competitor comes in, undercut the prices to compete with the competitor and therefore reduce the profits that the competitor is able to get. And that there's no real fixed costs of entry or exit, because otherwise the competitor is not going to be willing to spend those and then earn very low profits when it competes with the monopoly. So I think most of the time this notion of contestability is an implausible assumption. However, it is probably true that sometimes companies charge below their full monopoly prices as if no company could potentially compete because they're afraid of entry. And so it might get them a bit closer to average cost pricing. Okay. Now, notice that, of course, the whole motivation behind why you would want marginal cost rather than average cost pricing is that average costs are not the same thing as marginal costs. That is, the social optimum is to charge at the point where price is equal to marginal cost, not the point where price is equal to average cost, right? And that means that average cost pricing is inefficient. Therefore, in the cases where marginal cost pricing does lead to losses, when marginal costs are below average cost pricing is going to lead to too high prices and to too little quantity, just like monopoly would, right? Under average cost pricing, too little is produced. And that's not that dissimilar from the monopoly distortion, but it's not as extreme, as we'll see in a bit. So the social welfare loss under average cost pricing is the difference between average cost and marginal cost. And then we can calculate the social welfare losses as usual. So remember, in monopoly, the social welfare loss is the markup times the change in quantity, right? That's the marginal gain that we would get from a little bit more quantity is the markup times the increase in quantity. Here, it's going to be the difference between the average cost and the marginal cost times quantity, the change in quantity. So again, we get a Harburger triangle. And so again, the distortion is average cost minus marginal cost times, average cost minus marginal cost, which is the negative of the derivative of average cost times quantity. Now remember that demand is sort of the firm's average revenue, right? And it was P prime times Q, which was the distortion from monopoly. So there's a real symmetry here. It's the derivative of the average cost with respect to quantity times the quantity, which is the marginal distortion created by average cost pricing, whereas the distortion from monopoly is the derivative of the average revenue times the quantity, right? And again, we can go through a similar logic here. This is going to be proportional to the size of the market and the slope of the average cost curve, right? And the slope of the average cost curve is, of course, the divergence between the marginal cost and the average cost, right? Okay. So it's possible, remember though, that it's possible to have a natural monopoly with a marginal cost that's above their average cost. If, in that original picture that I drew, we're on this upward sloping part of the average cost curve, where nonetheless there's subadditivity, right? Okay, so let me just give you a graphical picture of this. Imagine that we have a demand curve. Here's the average cost curve, but we have economies of scale. So the marginal cost curve is below the average cost curve. Then the point where demand intersects the average cost curve is going to be at a lower quantity than where it intersects the marginal cost curve. And the deadweight loss is this Harburger triangle between the two curves. Okay. Now, this is perhaps the most classical distortion associated with average cost pricing. But you can get other distortions as well, and I want to talk about those. So first of all, the market may fail to exist even though it's efficient for it to exist when you have average cost pricing. And Oscar Serrano, could you tell me why the market might fail to exist under average cost pricing even though it would be socially valuable for it to exist? Well, the basic problem is that if you have average cost pricing, no one's going to enter the market unless there is a point where demand is above average cost, right? Because no one will be willing to pay the price if there's no point where demand is above average cost. But that doesn't mean there's no social value to the market being created. Why? Because demand may be below the average cost, but above the marginal cost everywhere, right? So in particular, let's think about the notion of notice that the demand curve is the marginal utility that people get from buying an additional good, right? That's what the price is. Price is equal to people's marginal utilities. But the average utility is different from that. The average utility is the total utility in the market divided by the quantity, whereas the marginal utility is the derivative of the utility with respect to the quantity. That is, the average utility has the same relationship to the demand curve that the average cost curve has to the marginal cost curve, right? And so what that means is that you could well have the average utility lying above everywhere the average cost, and yet the average cost will be everywhere above the demand curve. So let me give you a picture of that. So here's a market where the average cost curve is above the demand curve, which is above the marginal cost curve. And where would the average utility curve be? Well, it would have the same relationship to the average, demand curve that the marginal cost has the average cost. That is, it would be half as shallow, so it would be up here. So the market would be worth creating anywhere. Any level of quantity the market would be worth creating at, and yet it wouldn't be created under average cost pricing. What would happen under average cost pricing? Well, imagine we tried to create the market at this quantity, right? Then the average cost would be this amount. So we'd have to charge a price that's here. But if we charged a price that's here, then the quantity would be this, the average cost would be here. And then, you see, we go through this death spiral as the market collapses. Un ejemplo? Un minuto. Un minuto. But this can happen all the time. I mean, this is, if you think about any sort of a market where you have a marginal, large economies of scale, and you have a demand curve that is, sloping down a lot or, very curved, then it can very easily be the case that no one can ever justify entering the industry because they're not taking into account the consumer surplus that's being created. But if they did take that into account, then it would be worth entering the industry. Okay. So what about the case where marginal cost is actually above average cost? We're on that upward sloping part of that average cost curve, but we still have subadditivity, so we've got a natural monopoly. Or we've got one of these other cases where through free entry, we have average cost pricing rather than marginal cost pricing. Is Alberto Reyes here? No? Does anyone else want to try to explain what the distortion is in this case when the marginal cost is above the average cost? ¿Cómo? Yeah, cuando está en esta parte de the demand, the supply curve. What's the distortion here? What will be the problem with average cost pricing? Anybody? Too much quantity, right? Who said that? Yeah. So Roman's right. There's actually too much in this case rather than too little, right? So this is even more common when average cost pricing arises for other reasons, as we'll talk about in a minute. So in this case, there's oversupply. There's too much supplied if we have average cost pricing, not too little. So we get the opposite Harburger triangle. So here's the case. Imagine the marginal cost curve is upward sloping, and the average cost curve is also upward sloping, but not as upward sloping. Then we're going to get too much quantity supplied down here, and you get a Harburger triangle between the marginal cost and the average and the demand. Okay, so clearly average cost pricing is not an ideal solution. But there's still a question. Is it better than monopoly is? What do you think, Juan Castillo? Is average cost pricing or monopoly pricing better? How so? Yeah?
So is that it's better to have a monopoly?
No. That's exactly the case where monopoly is actually just as good at, guaranteed to be just as good as average cost pricing. Does anyone else want to? That was a good guess, but and that was sort of supposed to catch you, but it's not true. Okay. To the extent that the problem is under provision, monopoly is always worse than is competition. So including with market collapse. So let's look back at this graph. Would a monopoly ever want to enter this market? Well, where's his marginal revenue curve? It's down here. He's never going to want to enter. So anytime the market collapses under average cost pricing, the monopoly will not want to enter the market either. Similarly, imagine that we went back to this graph where there was a distortion. Which is going to be worse, monopoly or competition? Well, the marginal revenue curve is down here, right? So the quantity is even lower under monopoly, who sets marginal revenue equal to marginal cost, than it is under competition. Yes?
You mean better in the sense that there is a social benefit because the market.
Social benefit. Yeah. So anytime there is too little provision under average cost pricing, monopoly is even worse than that. On the other hand, what happens if marginal cost is above average cost? Jaime Naranjo is not actually showing up to this class, as you know. Well, if the cost, imagine that we're in this graph here. Imagine we're now in this graph. Well, what does the monopolist provide? He provides at this point, right? The social optimum is at this point. Here the monopoly looks like he's going to be worse, but notice it could be better or worse. It all just depends on the way that the curves are aligned with one another, right? So under average, when there is when there's over provision under competition, when the marginal cost and average cost curves are upward sloping, monopoly could be better, it could be worse. So let me give you an example of the case where monopoly is better. Imagine that the demand curve looks like this, so the marginal revenue curve is like this, and the marginal cost curve is like that, so the average cost curve is like that. So competition is going to supply at this point, monopoly will supply at this point, the social optimum is there. So then monopoly is clearly superior to the to average cost pricing. So monopoly, it may actually be better to leave a monopolist unregulated than to regulate him down to average cost if he's in the part of his curve where the marginal and average costs are increasing. Okay. Now, at least, hold on one second. At least as important as the static distortions we've been talking about of average cost pricing are its longer term incentives. And a big problem is that companies can easily make investments that impact their costs, right? So for example, they can make an effort to try to cut costs or cut workers, cut fat out of the business, to innovate by creating more efficient production processes, or to choose cheaper ways of doing something over more expensive ones. And there's a problem set that Miguel will go over in one of the sessions, which has you guys look at this if you want to look at that problem set. So unless all of these things are controlled and monitored by the regulator, the firm under average cost pricing has no incentives to reduce cost. Because if he reduces cost, all that happens is he keeps getting his average cost paid, and he doesn't care what his costs are. In fact, if the regulator learns about your costs over time, you might actually want to increase your cost. So a classic example of this is that my dad was working for a weapons contractor that was doing weapons contracting for the US government. And he came in and he said, look, I can get you guys 50% under budget on this project, right? And the guy said, I won't even consider your proposal. I would consider myself to have, absolutely abnegated my responsibility to serve my country if this project was 1 cent under budget. And he said, what are you talking about? He said, next year, they're going to appropriate the same amount that we spent this year on the next project. So if we go 1 cent under budget, the next year, we're not going to get as much money, right? So that's called the ratchet effect. So, if the regulator is trying to figure out how much it costs you, you really want to inflate your costs. You want to increase your costs so that they'll give you more money in your budget the next year. And similar sorts of problems happen with other costs of causes of average cost pricing. Actually, companies have an incentive, if other companies are going to try to enter the industry, to imitate them, to make it look like their costs are larger so that other companies won't come into the industry to imitate them, right? Anytime you have average cost pricing, firms will often have an incentive to inflate their costs. Okay. Now, one important cause of the distortions from average cost pricing, we know that the distortions from average cost pricing come from when the cost curves are downward sloping or when they're upward sloping. Now, what's a case when we don't have monopoly where we get downward sloping or upward sloping cost curves? One natural one is insurance. Let's imagine that the government was going to provide insurance to the population. And let's let the quantity represent the fraction of the population that's covered by insurance, right? And let's let P be the prevailing price for insurance. Now, obviously, if you try to cover more of the population, you're going to have to reduce the price in order to get more people covered. So that gives us a demand curve, right? But the costs are not going to be flat. They're not going to be constant marginal cost because people differ in terms of their risks. So the first case, and one of the most natural cases, is adverse selection. This is when the first people who come into the market are the people who are the most unhealthy. They're the ones who are willing to pay the most for insurance. If that's the case, then you're going to have downward sloping cost curves, right? Because the first people into the market are the most costly people. And then as you cover more people, you get less costly people, and so the cost curves slope downward. On the other hand, you could get a case of advantageous selection. When would that be? Imagine that rather than just having sick people who come into the market early on, you've got two types of people. One type are hypochondriacs, and they just think they're always going to get sick, right? And so they buy a lot of insurance. But they also take really good care of themselves because they're afraid of getting sick. So those people are really not costly at all to cover, and they might be the first people into the market, right? So in that case, the cost curves would actually slope upward because the first people into the market are the least costly, right? So that's called advantageous selection. It's also possible that you could have a mixture, that the cost curves could go down and up depending on exactly what the ordering of people entering the market is. Now, this is a cost curve for the industry as a whole, not for an individual firm. For an individual insurer, if there's many insurers and I come into the market, I'm going to get basically a representative sample of everyone who's already in the market. So therefore, we can think of the insurers as really doing average cost pricing. If I enter the market, I have to charge the price, which is equal to the representative sample of everyone in the market in order to stay in business. So a competitive insurance market will have prices equal to average cost. It will have average cost pricing. And yet, for the market as a whole, there will be these decreasing and increasing cost curves, which are going to lead to exactly the sorts of distortions that we talked about here. If we have adverse selection, we're going to have these downward sloping average and marginal cost curves, and we're going to get this distortion from of having too little insurance. And here's a very famous case of market collapse. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of the story of lemons from Akerlof. So Akerlof talked about the case where the first people who came into the market were the people who are the most costly to serve, and he talked about how the market could collapse. And that happens exactly in this case that we described. On the other hand, if we have the hypochondriacs, we're going to get too much provision of insurance, and we're going to get a case like this. Now, adverse selection, we're going to focus on the case of insurance because it's a prominent one, but this happens in all sorts of other markets, right? So Akerlof talked about the used car market. The first people who want to sell their cars are the people who have the crappiest cars, or at least that's the story he told. The first people who seek to get loans are often the people who are the best credit risks because they have the most valuable projects to do with it. And so there might be advantageous selection in that case, right? So in many, many contexts, there are cases where different consumers are of different value, and a competitive market supplies at the average value of all those consumers, and that leads to exactly the types of distortions that we've been describing, right? Okay. And all the things we said about whether a monopoly or competition is better in that, or average cost pricing is better in that case, is going to determine whether monopoly or competition is better in those cases. Okay, so selection is therefore really just about the slope of the cost curve, right? That's what determines whether there's a distortion or not, right? And so if we can measure the slope of the average cost curve, we know how much distortion there will be in a competitive insurance market. And that's exactly what Laurent Aynave and co-authors did in a 2010 paper. So they went to a large aluminum manufacturer who offered two different insurance plans. The first plan had a low coverage for diseases that you got, but was also cheap. And the second plan was fairly comprehensive, but expensive. And individual managers of different plants got to decide how much they wanted to subsidize the more expensive plan, right? And their claim, though who knows if this is really true, is that this was done pretty randomly. But if they're right, then what this means is we got to see different places where there were different quantities, right? Because the prices differed, and that led different numbers of people to take the high plan versus the low plan. And they measured the average cost as the additional claims that the insurer had to pay if they were in the high plan versus the low plan, right? And so you've got to draw out the average and marginal costs of going into the high plan versus going into the low plan. And the difference between these average and marginal costs is the marginal distortion. Now, the size of the total distortion that's created, of course, depends on the demand function, because that Harburger triangle is determined by where the demand function cuts down, right? So if this was the demand function and this is the marginal distortion, if the demand function was much flatter, there would be a much bigger distortion, right? Okay, so here's exactly what they did. They looked at all these different places where the managers charged these different prices, and they said, okay, what fraction of people at these different prices chose the different demands? And they drew out a demand curve. They made it linear. It's sort of a little bit more like concave and looks sort of like this, right? What about the costs? Well, they looked at these different places at what all the costs were of covering the people, and that gave them this average cost curve, right? And they were just able, doing that, using the average cost curve, you can take a derivative and get the marginal cost curve. That gives you this wedge right here. And you can calculate the Harburger triangle using their analysis. So that's how empirically you measure these distortions created by selection. OK. Now, one thing to notice here is this is a pretty small Harburger triangle, right? This average cost curve is sloping down a little bit, but not too much. And in fact, what they found is that you only lose about 5 to 10% of the welfare in this market from adverse selection. Now, Akerlof told all these stories about how the markets would collapse and how terrible things would be, right? But one thing to notice here is, why is the distortion here so small? One story you might tell is that, So first of all, the distortion is very small here. And in fact, there are other studies that have been done by these authors that actually found advantageous selection, actually found there was too much insurance. So that seems really disappointing. You think there's this whole big literature that's talking about how insurance markets are really prone to adverse selection, how they might fall apart if we don't have really good regulation. And a lot of people were really frustrated that you go out and measure these things, and in fact, if anything, there's many cases when there's too much insurance, and in the cases where there's too little insurance, it's by a very small amount. You don't see these things and whatever. But one response to this is that, look, you're looking at insurance markets. In order to do this exercise that they did, where you move around the prices, the insurance market has to exist in the first place for that to be possible. And we should think that the biggest adverse selection is in markets that end up not existing, where the market collapses, right? And how can we look at that using this methodology? We can't, right? So a guy who was on the job market this year came up with a very brilliant way to get around this problem. And if Sergio was here, I would ask him to tell me what he did. But does anyone else know what happened? Yeah, Juan. Describe what rejection is.
Rejection is that they could not find insurance at a reasonable price.
Yeah, at any price. It means there was no market for insurance for these people, right? Yeah.
And those who were not.
Yeah.
And he made the difference between the distinct
Yeah.
prices, and then he measured he said that this insurance had some private information about
Yeah.
some samples.
Yeah.
So he used like a residual
Yeah.
of the information that the investigator had, and
Yeah.
that of the insurer, and concluded that the private information that they had was quite important.
Yeah.
To explain that effect.
Yeah, so that's exactly right. So he found some really interesting evidence of this. So what he did is he looked at markets where you can't get insurance at any price, and he asked whether selection might be the cause of this, right? And the way he did that is he looked at surveys of the individuals when they were signing up for insurance of how likely they thought it was that they were going to get sick in the future. And then he said, how much did they actually get sick in the future? That's a measure of how much they knew about how sick they would get. And then you can take out of that all the things that the company could observe and price on, which were like, their weight, age, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you can take out all the stuff that's left over, which is controlling for all those things, how good was the person at predicting how sick they would get. And if the people know a lot more than the insurer does, then you'd think that the people who are most sick are going to be the first ones into the market, and the adverse selection distortion could be very bad, right? So you can do this exactly with the average and marginal cost reasoning that we were talking about if you focus on the first unit of insurance that would be sold to the person. So you say, how much would the different people be willing to pay for the first bit of insurance that they get, given the risk that they have? And you can set up an average and marginal cost curve for that first unit of insurance, and then you can ask how much people would have to be willing to pay for insurance in order to offset the distortion that's created by adverse selection. That tells you whether the market will collapse or not. So basically what I'm saying is that if we have this graph over here, we can say, here's the distortion between average and marginal cost. How high would the demand curve have to be in order to offset that distortion? How much more would people have to be willing to pay than the cost of insuring them in order for the market to exist, right? And so he just calculated all of those things. And what he found is, pretty amazingly, is that in every single market where the market had collapsed, where there was no market for the insurance, the premium you'd have to be willing to pay to get that first unit of insurance was at least 50% over the cost of providing it. Whereas in every market that still existed, the premium was below 50%. So his claim was, if people's insurance premia are typically, if people's willingness to pay for insurance is typically around 50%, that's exactly what you would see. You would see the market wouldn't exist in the ones where it was above 50%, would exist in where it was below 50%. So the theory was able to perfectly explain what you saw. So let me just give you one example of a graph. So what he did is he looked at what was the residual private information of people who were able to get life insurance versus weren't able to get life insurance. So the people who weren't able to get life insurance had this very tightly clustered private information about their things. So, sorry, these are the people who were able to get insurance. So they had this very tightly clustered thing, so they had very little private information about what was going to happen to them. On the other hand, the people who couldn't get insurance looked like this, very diffuse. So you would expect that the average cost would be way above the marginal cost in that case, right? And that's exactly what you got. You got that the markets existed when you would expect them to exist and didn't exist where you wouldn't expect them to exist. So what that tells you is that the reason why you were getting such low distortions from adverse selection previously was because the theory was working too well. The markets where the adverse selection was bad were collapsing, and the markets that were left had very little adverse selection. Okay, so the same types of approaches that were used to try to deal with the regulation down to marginal costs in the monopoly setting can be used in the insurance setting as well. In fact, any intervention and any problem with any intervention that shows up in the standard marginal versus average cost pricing for a natural monopoly shows up in marginal versus average cost pricing for insurance. So one standard approach is to provide subsidies for insurance. Now, what did we remember were the problems with providing subsidies? Well, this is a widely advocated policy solution, but it requires that you know all sorts of things about the cost function, which is that you have to know all about the adverse selection and what would be the optimal amount of insurance, because otherwise you can provide way too much insurance in the market. Another possibility is you could put a mandate for universal coverage, the same way that you could force the company to produce more things. And Oscar, Oscar Quiroga, what could be the problem with that? Why not? Why wouldn't it be inefficient to force everyone to get insurance? Well, I mean, that's just a matter of cost. But the question is, why socially would it be inefficient to cover everyone? Well, that's true, but in principle, we think if people are risk averse, they should all want to have insurance, right? So why not force everyone to have insurance? Does anyone else have an idea why it might be inefficient to force everyone to have insurance? Yeah.
There are some costs for the insurance, just like administration.
Yeah, so that's one reason. I mean, in the end, we're going to have to find some reason why, if we look at these cost functions here, why it wouldn't be the case that this demand curve lies everywhere above the marginal cost curve. So one reason is the administrative cost. What's another reason? Does anyone else have it? ¿Cómo? Pero si todos son aversos a los riesgos, sí. The problem is people might not take as good care of their health if they have insurance, right? And people might be different in the extent to which they respond by not taking care of themselves, right? And to the extent that that's true, it might be inefficient to force everyone to get insurance, right? So administrative costs are one reason, but also there might be moral hazard, right? How about discrimination against different people? I mean, another natural approach that we take in monopoly is if I can discriminate against everyone based on their health status, then the problems start to go away because I solve the problem that some people are more costly than others. So, Juan, what might be problems in trying to achieve that?
A lot of the people wouldn't accept that because the most vulnerable, like many poor old people, would have to pay a lot and it would be possible for them.
Yeah, so it causes a lot of redistribution, like the other discrimination we were talking about. Anyone else have other ideas about what might be a problem with that? Yeah, it requires you know everything that the people know, right? And while they were willing to say it to a survey, they might not be willing to say it if they knew that they would get charged more premium for that, right? In particular, it adds risk to people who don't have long-term insurance. So imagine that I start my life, with insurance, but then as I, that insurance only lasts for 1 year. And imagine during that year I contract a disease. Now that disease is not going to make me really sick this year, but it will make me really sick in the future. If the insurer can know that and charge me more based on that, then what's the point of having insurance in the first place? The whole point of insurance was to avoid having to pay a lot in the future for my health. But now I'm paying a giant premium. I've lost most of the benefits associated with insurance. So all of these issues come up in other selection contexts. So one example of that is the markets for sort of murky assets. So this happened a lot during the financial crisis, right? there were a lot of people who had really bad financial assets, and they were trying to sell them. And the problem is, no one wanted to buy them because they were afraid that the people who most wanted to sell them had the worst assets, right? And that led markets to collapse. Other things happen in markets for consumer credit lending, right? Imagine that it's the case that there are, that the people who most want loans are the people who have the best thing to do with the money and are most likely to repay, therefore, right? Then there's actually going to be too much lending that could lead to a really bad subprime crisis, right? Because everyone's going to be chasing after the people who are, good credit risks, and therefore making loans to people who are bad credit risks because they can't distinguish between the two. Labor markets for skilled workers, for example. It might be that there's, if you can't tell how good a worker is and whether the worker is willing to work for you depends, or is willing to work at all, depends on how good they are at work in one way or the other. You're going to either get too much employment or too little employment, right? So, in all of these cases, all the issues that we've been talking about become really important issues for regulating the markets. Now, in insurance, well, I think that these advantageous selection issues are a huge problem. There's also other issues. So sometimes people are irrationally loyal to particular brands. So like they just care about the insurer that they happen to have had for a while, even though they're providing exactly the same product. And there's some really nice evidence from Ben Handel that's about that. So he showed that people were often choosing an insurance plan that no matter what happened to them would cost like $1,000 more just because they couldn't compute how much they had to pay in all of the different cases. So that's a major problem in insurance. There's this issue of short versus long run insurance. We really want insurance that will last our whole lifetime so that if we get sick, we'll be provided for in the future. But if the insurance only lasts a year, that can be really bad, right? Another problem that you run into with that is that if I'm with an insurer and they don't expect to be my insurer for a long time, they may not be willing to pay me in order to go to the gym and do other things that reduce the costs of my insurance in the future because they don't think they'll be my insurer in the future, right? And that may lead to an under-provision of preventative care. There can also be a lack of competition. So monopoly doesn't always cause problems. We found out with advantageous selection it can make things better, but it often can make things worse than adverse selection, and often insurance markets are quite concentrated, especially in the United States. Though, again, that can have benefits because of the selection issues and because if you have just one insurer, then they do know they'll be your insurer in the future, so they have an incentive to give you money for preventive care. Okay, so selection gives a really nice language for thinking about the debate over health care in the United States. I don't know if anyone's followed the idea of Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act. What Obamacare did was to, first of all, make it illegal to discriminate against people based on pre-existing conditions, and second of all, to require everyone to buy health insurance. And the logic of selection or the death spiral justifies why you would put these two policies together. So what would be the problem of having non-discrimination without the individual mandate? I was going to ask Francisco, but he's not here. Well, the problem of having non-discrimination without a mandate is that you could get into a death spiral. If all the people who had the worst health conditions, you couldn't discriminate against them, they would all get into the market, and that would cause premia to go up so much that none of the healthy people would want to buy it, and the market could fall apart, right? Though there's some question about whether that's actually the case based on recent research. But okay, second, what would be the problem, Gabrielle, of having the mandate that everyone has to buy insurance without having the requirement that you can't discriminate based on pre-existing conditions?
Well, I guess that probably the companies wouldn't receive as much money as they would have to spend for some patients.
Well, but we're allowed to discriminate. So here you're allowed to discriminate, right? And so you could discriminate however you want. The question is, what would be the problem forcing people to buy insurance if there wasn't a guarantee that you wouldn't have discrimination based on pre-existing conditions? So imagine you could discriminate freely, but everyone has to buy insurance. What would be the problem there?
How you can discriminate freely?
Yeah.
There will probably be very different prices for people.
And so then what would be the problem about forcing everyone to buy insurance?
Excuse me?
Why would it be a problem to force everyone to buy insurance then? Oscar, did you have an idea?
I thought about it, but no.
Anyone else? Yeah.
How can you discriminate if you don't have pre-existing conditions? I'll make a guess.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm thinking here in Colombia
Yeah.
it makes different because we have income distribution very bad. So
Yeah.
a lot of people would be discriminated, wouldn't be able to pay.
Exactly. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Yeah, so the problem is that if you allow people to discriminate and yet you force people to buy insurance, for some people the insurance may be so expensive there's no way they're going to be able to afford it. Okay, so why put these two policies together? Why institute the policies at all? Well, a natural reason is that it helps provide long-term insurance against the fact that if I get sick this year, that my premium will go up next year. If everyone's forced into the system and we have this, mandate, then that solves both the adverse selection problems, but it also solves the reclassification risk problems. So it gives us a much more comprehensive system of insurance than would be possible in a private market. Now, Juan Rojas, what are arguments that we might use against these pair of policies? And what are the costs of over-provision? We talked about them a little bit before. We talked about it just a minute ago. What's the social cost of having too much insurance? What's the problem that it creates? Yeah, Oscar? Yeah, people don't take care of themselves enough, right? If we give too many people insurance, right? Okay, I should let you guys go because people want to come in.
It's desirable to have this, we call it here universal coverage. Would it be okay to take that risk that people wouldn't take care of, or wouldn't it be better to have risk to that point, that problem, to try to solve it?
Well, it's a trade-off. I mean, it's a quantitative question of how big each of the two effects is. It could well be that you're right, but I mean, I haven't seen any compelling proof that that effect is bigger.
And if there is a benefit in health or an economic effect, because people, well, maybe they are, but maybe they get sicker because they don't take good care, but maybe they can be cured or get better anyway, so there will be a trade-off there.
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, but that's the trade-off. I mean, the costs imposed by them getting more sick because they don't take good care versus the benefits of greater insurance, right? So that's the trade-off. And we're going to talk about the insurance versus incentives trade-off a whole bunch in the class on next Thursday. But until then, have a great weekend, and I'll see you guys on Monday. Oh, and by the way, I don't know if people have seen, but there's now